But at the same time, it is illuminating to step back and think that somebody thought through every aspect of that infrastructure system. And in many cases, I'm being directed perhaps in ways that are not healthy. And how can we make that infrastructure system better? That's going to take people who are aware that in many cases they are being guided by that infrastructure.
So that's a good thing to focus in on,
Okay.
I think, too, at the moment. And this is where we could have a discussion about postmodernism and modernism and maybe what comes next. So let me lay out a couple of propositions for you and tell me what you think about this. This is maybe the nexus of what I was hoping to discuss with you. So I'll give the postmodernist devils their due to begin with, and you can tell me what your opinion is about that. So I think that we are on the cusp of a philosophical and maybe a theological revolution. And I think it's in part because the postmodernists identified some of the flaws in Enlightenment thinking. And so the postmodernists, the fundamental postmodernist insistence, as far as I can discern, is that we by necessity see the world through a story. And so I've been trying to figure out what that means. And the large language model, emergence of the large language models have helped out with that. So imagine that and I want you to correct me if I get any of this wrong. The rationalist presumption is that we do see the world through a framework. The empirist presumption is that we derive our knowledge of the world from a set of, in a sense, self-evident facts that emerge in the domain of perception. But there's a problem with both of those notions. Is the nature of the rationalist framework isn't precisely specified, and it isn't obvious at all that there's a level of self-evident fact. In fact, I think the data, the scientific data on the neuroscience and the engineering side indicate quite clearly that that's just not the case, that you can't separate perception, let's say, from motivation. You can't separate perception from action, because all of your senses are active while they're gathering so-called data. There's no sense data. And so I've been trying to wrestle with what that means exactly, because one possible interpretation of the idea that there's no base level of sense data is a descent into a nihilistic or relativistic morass. And I don't think that's a tenable solution either, not least for motivational and emotional reasons. I think there's a clue to the manner in which this problem might be solved in the fact of the large language models. So what they essentially do is establish a weighting system between conceptions. And so in the large language models, every word, let's say, is associated with every other word at a certain level of probability. So if word A appears, there's some probability that word B will come next. And then if phrase A appears, there's some probability that phrase B will appear, and the same with sentences and the same with paragraphs. And there's literally hundreds of billions of these parameters in those models. And what they've done is map out the weight of data points. So, if there's 5 facts at hand, and I could, in principle, use those facts to guide my perception or my action, I still have to solve the problem of how I would weight the facts. And you might say, well, you don't have to weight them. And I would say, well, no, that just means you've all weighted them equivalently. There's no, if you have more than one thing at hand and you have to combine them in some manner, you have to weight them. There's no option. And you can weight them all one, but that's also a decision and it's arbitrary. And so instead, even to perceive, we have to weight the facts. And as far as I can tell, a story is a description of the structure that we use to weight the facts. And so that doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that our perceptions have no structure and that everything's subjective, but it also doesn't mean that the facts speak to for themselves, like the empiricists would insist, or the behaviorists for that matter, that there's a stimulus and then there's an automatic response or something of that nature. So I know that's a bit of a scattershot, but I hope you can see what I'm aiming at. And I guess I'm wondering, what do you think of the proposition that we see the world through a story, for example? Hello, everybody. So my wife and I are going back out on tour. for my new book, We Who Wrestle with God. I'm going to be walking through a variety of biblical stories. Now, the postmodern types and the neo-Marxists, they think the story is one of power, and that is a dangerous story. The fundamental rock upon which true civilization is built is encapsulated in the biblical stories. And so I've spent a lot of time trying to understand them. And the point of the tour and the book is to bring whatever understanding I've managed to develop to as wide an audience as possible.
All right, already we're into heavy-duty epistemology, right? Neuroscience, right? History, psychology, value sets, including motivation issues, and so on. Okay, so, right. Just hold on to that for a moment. All right, so I'm going to say you're right. Traditional empiricism has had problems. Traditional rationalism has had problems. And that we cannot accept in post-analysis sort out all of the elements, and that's a big part of what the scientific project goes on. But let me start by defending the empiricists for a moment. So what I just did on the table, right, shocking.
Was that Johnson who kicked the stone?
Okay, G.E. Moore.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And, but also, earlier in when he was talking about the
I refute you thus, isn't that?
That's right. Right, which is it's in the right track, but still too naive. Okay, but just reflect on that experience if we start to try to defend the empiricists for a moment. So I smacked the table completely out of the blue, but for anybody who's listening, right, or watching, that was sense data. You had no motivational set. You had no story in mind. You had no behavioral preconditions to set for you. There was an experience, and you were aware of the experience. Now, what you then go on to do with that experience is going to be an extraordinarily complicated thing. And all of the things that you are laying out are exactly right. So the empiricist commitment, I think, if it's going to be properly done, has to be that there are such things like the smacking on the table and various other sorts of things that ultimately, when we get all of the other things sorted out, and sometimes we have to do this in laboratories where we have isolated all of the variables, there is a residual direct contact with empirical reality.
Right, something that's outside the subjective.
No, but even there, the language becomes very important because we don't want to say that it's subjective, at least as philosophers use the term, because that then is to say it's not in relationship to what is out there. So, again, we have to get into the technical epistemology very carefully. When philosophers talk about the subjective, sometimes they just mean anything that is happening right on the subjective side. But if we were doing epistemology or knowledge, then we say subjectivism means that the terms for what we are calling a belief or calling a knowledge or whatever it is set by the subject. And the external reality has nothing to do with it. The opposite position then is some sort of revelatory model where the subject has absolutely nothing to do with it. Instead, just reality smacks that person in the face. And as you put it, the story doesn't need to be told. It wears on its face what the proper interpretation of it is. What I think the proper starting point for any good epistemology is not going to be either of those. So we have to understand consciousness as a response mechanism to reality. It's an inherently relational phenomenon. And you always have to talk about reality and the conscious response to the reality. What very quickly happens in so many philosophies is people think, well, if the subject is involved, then there's no way for us to be aware of reality. They retreat to some sort of representationalist model, or they start going internal, and then they start talking about motivations and theory ladens and other beliefs that you have. And once you make that divide, there is no way to get out of the subject and back to reality. On the other hand, if you try to react to that and say the subject can have nothing to do with it because we really think there is such a thing as knowledge, then you try as desperately as you can to erase the subject, right? To pretend the subject doesn't exist, to turn the subject into some sort of super shiny mirror that just reflects things, or some sort of diaphanous reincorporation of exactly what's out there happens inside the subject. But that also is an impossible model. So what I want to say is the empiricist commitment, and historically the empiricists have struggled to work this out. This is the ongoing project. In the early modern era, I think they had very weak accounts of sense perception, and that was part of the big problem. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, postmodernism centuries later is the end result of teasing out the sometimes very subtle weaknesses in those very early models. So, what I would just say is the first project for empiricists is to argue that there is a residual, right, base level in contact that can serve as the basis for knowledge and the test for everything else, no matter how sophisticated it starts. But that, as an epistemological claim, has to work with a certain understanding of philosophy of mind. You can't do the epistemology entirely in abstraction from some sort of neuroscience, some sort of understanding of psychology, the relation of the mind to the body, and both of them to the other, to reality rather. And I think the important point here is to see consciousness as a relational phenomenon, and that's a philosophy of mind claim. It's not
so
just.
Let's talk.
Let me just say, it's not a shiny mirror that simply reflects reality. It's not a pre-existing entity that has its own nature and just kind of makes up whatever it wants for itself. It's a response mechanism, and all of these other things have to come out of that. Let me just say one more thing. I think we talk a lot about epistemology, and epistemological concerns really have dominated modern philosophy, modern psychology, the modern scientific project. And I think that's fine to
define that for people, epistemology.
The theory of knowledge. So we try to figure out, so the